Hello, dear friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Whether you're nestled under warm blankets in the countryside, or winding down in the middle of a busy city. Take a moment to leave a comment below. You're not alone here. We're all resting together, wherever we are. Now let's drift gently into a story as old as time, a story of darkness, struggle, and a mysterious encounter with the divine. This is the night Jacob wrestled with God. The desert had a strange kind of silence, not empty, not hollow, but thick, like a breath held for too long. The moon hovered low and heavy over the distant hills, painting the rocks in soft silver. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cried, then faded back into the stillness. And Jacob was alone. He had crossed the river earlier that day, carefully guiding his family, his servants, his animals, all the people and things he had gathered in his long, complicated life. One by one, they had gone ahead of him, and now the campfires were tiny specks of orange across the water. He could have gone with them. He could have chosen to sit by the warmth of the flames, surrounded by familiar faces, the smell of baked bread, and the soft hum of conversation. But instead, he stayed behind. Something in his soul had told him, "You're not ready yet." The ground beneath his feet was cool and sandy, dotted with the footprints of camels and men. But now it was just his. This piece of land, this moment, this night, it belonged to him and whatever was coming. The stars blinked in silence overhead, but Jacob didn't look up. He kept his gaze low, heart tight in his chest, mind wandering back through the years, the trickery, the deceit, the stolen blessing, the fear, the running, the bargains made with God on stony pillows and trembling dreams. Life had never given him peace. And now, on the edge of his greatest confrontation, a reunion with the brother he once wronged, Jacob found himself unable to move forward. Not yet. So he sat, and the night deepened around him like a velvet cloak. The wind whispered through the scrubby trees, rustling dry leaves that danced like spirits in the dark. The river behind him murmured its endless lullaby, but it brought no comfort, not tonight. This wasn't the kind of solitude that relaxes the soul. It was the kind that exposes it. Jacob could feel it, the quiet working on him, the way silence can turn into a mirror. There were no distractions here, no noise, no one to impress, no one to deceive, no masks left to wear, just the sound of his own breath and the deep, aching weight of everything he had carried for so long. How long had it been since he had truly stopped? Not just paused, but surrendered to the moment. Not just escaped from his problems, but allowed himself to face them. He thought about his name, Jacob, the supplanter, the heel grabber, always chasing, always reaching, always trying to prove something, or win something, or take something that didn't quite belong to him. And what had it all cost him? What had he become in the process? The moon climbed higher, casting its glow on the rocks around him. Shadows stretched and shifted, like the memories rising inside his heart. Every lie, every betrayal, every selfish choice. They came back now, not to condemn him, but to be acknowledged, to be seen. There was no more running from them. They had followed him here, and they had caught up. And still, there was that silence. Not the silence of absence, but of waiting. As if the night itself was holding its breath, watching him, expecting something. Jacob could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Something, or someone. And he wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew with absolute clarity that tonight would change him. Forever. Jacob had been running for as long as he could remember. It had started in the womb, they said, grasping at his brother Esau's heel even before his first breath. That was the story his mother told. You came into this world already reaching, already fighting to be first. Maybe it was just a tale, a poetic way of explaining the man he would become. But in Jacob's heart, it felt true. He had always lived in the shadow of someone else, always wanted something that wasn't his, always believed that love or blessing or safety had to be taken by force or cleverness. He remembered his childhood, the way his father Isaac favored Esau. Esau, with his strong arms, wild spirit, and scent of the outdoors. Esau, who hunted, who brought back the meat their father loved, who seemed to fit the mold of what a man should be. And Jacob? He stayed closer to the tents, closer to his mother Rebekah. He was quieter, more cunning. He watched, he listened, he waited, and eventually he struck. He remembered the deal over a bowl of stew, how easily Esau had surrendered his birthright. Jacob had cooked the lentils slowly that day, watching his brother approach from the fields, weary and hungry. The smell of the stew was almost a trap, and when Esau begged for a taste, Jacob asked for something in return, the birthright. It was a simple trade on the surface, but underneath, it was Jacob's first real step into a life of manipulation. And then the blessing, the disguise, the trembling old father whose failing eyesight couldn't tell one son from the other, the goatskins on his arms, the stolen words, the borrowed identity. The moment when Jacob, pretending to be Esau, received what he had always longed for, the father's sacred blessing. But it hadn't brought him peace, only fear. Because as soon as Esau found out, Jacob had to run. He ran from his brother's rage. He ran from the guilt that hung around his neck like a chain. He ran toward his uncle Laban, hoping for a fresh start, but finding more deception, and more of himself in Laban than he wanted to admit. Years passed. He worked. He schemed. He married. He gained wealth, livestock, children. On the surface, he became a man of power and success. But underneath it all, he was still that boy, the one who didn't believe he could be loved simply for who he was, the one who had to trick, to strive, to fight for every inch of blessing. And always, he was running. Not just from Esau anymore, but from something deeper, from the questions he couldn't answer, from the ache that never left him, from the gnawing sense that everything he had built might still come crashing down. It's strange how a person can be surrounded by people, by noise, by motion, and still feel utterly pursued. Jacob knew that feeling well. He had lived in the tension between what he wanted and what he feared. He wanted blessing, but feared exposure. He wanted love, but feared rejection. He wanted peace, but only knew how to survive through control. Even when God appeared to him in dreams, a ladder stretching to heaven, angels ascending and descending, Jacob had responded with a deal. If you protect me, if you provide, then you'll be my God. Not surrender, not trust, just another bargain, another attempt to negotiate control in a world that had always felt uncertain. But control is a heavy burden, and it always slips through your fingers in the end. Now, as Jacob sat alone by the river, he felt the weight of all those years pressing in on him, the years of fleeing, of pretending, of grasping. He could feel it in his chest, in his breathing, in the way the silence seemed to lean closer. He was tired, tired of running, tired of lying, tired of being Jacob. He had come to this river because he had no choice. Esau was on the other side, approaching with 400 men. There would be no more escaping, no more tricks to play, No more hiding behind herds or wives or wealth. If his brother still wanted revenge, then so be it. And yet beneath that fear, something else stirred. Not just dread, but longing. A longing to stop running, to be seen, to be changed. He didn't know how. He didn't know what it would cost. But for the first time, perhaps in his entire life, Jacob was still, not in body, but in soul. And in that stillness, something ancient and holy was drawing near. There was no warning, no flash of lightning, no thunder to split the sky, no booming voice from above or angelic choir descending through the stars. Just the sound of the night, quiet, steady, unchanged. And then, out of that stillness, came a figure. At first, Jacob could barely see it. The shadows along the riverbank were deep, and the moonlight was subtle, casting silver outlines rather than clear shapes. The figure moved like a man, but there was something about it that unsettled him. Not fear, not yet, but a kind of tension, as if the air had thickened around him, as if something sacred had just stepped into his story, without asking for permission. He rose to his feet instinctively, every part of his body alert. The man came closer, not speaking, not explaining. He didn't seem to belong to any tribe. He didn't look like a traveler. He didn't carry weapons, yet there was something unmistakably powerful in his presence, as though the earth itself held its breath with every step he took. And then he lunged. Without a word, without warning, the figure grabbed Jacob, and they fell to the ground like two storm clouds colliding. Jacob fought back instinctively, not from logic, but from the same raw survival instinct that had guided him all his life. He didn't have time to ask who this was or why he had come. All he knew was that he was being attacked, and he would not lose. Not here, not now. The struggle was unlike anything Jacob had ever known. This was no ordinary fight. There was no swordplay, no shouting, no clear advantage. It was wrestling, the most intimate and exhausting of contests. Body against body, breath against breath. Every muscle strained, every nerve screamed. The ground beneath them was torn up by feet and hands, rocks rolling, dust flying into the air, but neither gave in. And the silence remained. No grunts of pain, no taunts, no words exchanged, only the sound of flesh against flesh, the gasping of lungs, the trembling of exertion. Hours passed, though Jacob could not tell how many. Time seemed to bend, as if the stars had slowed their path across the heavens. All he knew was that he was locked in this mysterious, sacred combat, and that he could not, would not, let go. But slowly, doubt crept in. Who was this? A man, an angel, or something more terrifying? The longer they wrestled, the more Jacob felt it. A presence that was beyond human. The strength that pressed against him didn't just come from muscle. It came from a place deeper than bone or sinew, as though the weight of eternity itself was bearing down on him. And still, he held on. Because Jacob had always held on. That had been his way, gripping the heel of his brother, gripping opportunity, gripping blessings that were never freely given. He didn't know how to surrender. He only knew how to grasp. But this was different. This was not a man he could deceive, not an opponent he could outsmart, not a problem he could solve by planning or cleverness. This was a confrontation with something, someone who knew him completely, and maybe, just maybe, had been waiting for this night. In the heart of the struggle, a strange thing began to happen. Jacob wasn't just fighting to protect himself anymore. He wasn't just wrestling to win. The struggle turned inward. It became about something deeper, the ache of his soul, the weight of his years, the longing he had never been able to name. It was as if this figure, whoever or whatever he was, had come not to destroy him, but to draw out everything Jacob had buried. His fear, his shame, his loneliness, his desperate need to be blessed, not by stealing it, not by pretending, but by being seen and loved as himself. And so he wrestled, with the man, with himself, with God. The question was no longer, who is this? The question was, why now? Why here? Why would the creator of the universe come like this, in disguise, in silence, in the middle of the night, and choose to wrestle with a man? Why not speak from a cloud? Why not send a dream? Why this strange, bruising embrace in the dark? And maybe that was the answer. Because some truths can't be spoken, they have to be wrestled with. Some blessings don't come in quiet devotionals or warm feelings. They come in the struggle, in the moments when everything you are is brought into question. It was here, in the dirt, in the chaos, in the exhaustion of wrestling through the night, that Jacob began to understand something he never could have learned in comfort. The darkness was deep, wrapping around them like a shroud. The stars overhead spun slowly in their silent dance, bearing witness to something sacred and unseen by all but God. No one else was there. No audience, no applause, no one to document or explain what was happening. Just two figures locked together in a relentless struggle, their breaths rising like smoke into the chill of the night air. And the struggle did not end. Minute after minute, hour after hour, the two wrestled without pause, without speaking, without rest. Each time Jacob thought he might gain the upper hand, his opponent resisted. Each time his muscles burned and cried out, he clenched his jaw and pushed through the pain. He had never fought this long, never felt this much weakness inside his strength. The night had no mercy. It stretched on endlessly, like a test with no answer key, like a prayer echoing off the walls of heaven and returning in silence. And yet, Jacob would not let go. He had come to this place fearing his brother, dreading the encounter he thought might end in blood. But now, all that fear was far away, almost forgotten. This struggle, this mysterious and sacred fight, had become his entire world. There was no room for anything else. Nothing existed but the hands gripping him and the force pressing against his soul. He didn't know what he was holding on to anymore. Was it a man, an angel, God himself? He didn't know. And maybe he didn't need to. What he knew was that this fight was not just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, existential. Something in him was dying, and something else was being born. Every time he gasped for breath, every time he thought he might fall apart, a voice inside him whispered, "Hold on." Not because he could win, but because something holy was happening. Something that could only happen here, in the dark. This wasn't a test of strength. It was a test of soul. Because there comes a point in every life when the night won't end, when the struggle doesn't resolve, when your prayers feel like they're hitting a closed door, when everything you thought would work doesn't, when your past finally catches up, when your fears begin to speak louder than your faith, when all the old strategies fall apart, when God is silent or disguised, or, in Jacob's case, wrestling you to the ground. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can let go, give up, walk away, or you can stay in the struggle. You can dig your heels into the dust and say, with all the breath left in your lungs, I will not let go. Not because you understand, not because it makes sense, but because something deep within you knows. This moment matters more than anything else. This is where the blessing lives, not in escaping the fight, but in enduring it. And so Jacob endured. His arms ached, his body trembled, sweat mixed with dust on his skin, his knees scraped the rocky earth, his eyes burned with fatigue, but still, he clung to the one who had come to meet him in the night. And the man, or the angel, or the mystery that Jacob wrestled, did not leave. That may be the greatest miracle of the night, that God did not strike him down, that he did not leave Jacob in the dust, that he chose to stay in the struggle, to meet a flawed, fearful, tired man in the dark, and not speak, not teach, not even comfort, but to wrestle him into transformation, because the longest night is not the one that punishes you, it's the one that prepares you. It strips away your pride, your titles, your tricks, your masks. It forces you to face who you really are. And in the mystery of that struggle, somewhere between the pain and the perseverance, you begin to meet the God who doesn't just speak from mountaintops or whisper in dreams, but who steps into the dirt and wrestles with you face to face. And when the sun finally began to rise, when the faintest glow crept over the horizon, Jacob was still holding on, weakened, wounded, but still holding on. Just as the first blush of dawn began to edge over the horizon, something shifted. The struggle had gone on for hours, but now Jacob felt it, not in his muscles or bones, but in his spirit. A moment of decision, a moment of divine intention. The figure he wrestled with, silent and fierce through the long night, did something unexpected. He reached out and touched Jacob's hip. That was all. Just a touch. Not a blow, not a wrenching pull, not the force of divine wrath. A simple touch, but it was enough. Pain exploded through Jacob's side, deep and immediate. His leg buckled beneath him as something tore out of place. The joint gave way with a sickening shift, and Jacob cried out, falling into the dust, barely able to support his own weight. He had been strong. He had endured the night. He had wrestled through every hour of darkness with unrelenting determination. And now, in an instant, he was broken. There is something unspeakably humbling about being touched by God and left with a wound. Something that strips away every illusion of control, every story you've told yourself about your strength or your worthiness. Jacob had lived by his cunning, survived by his cleverness, fought for his blessing through trickery and toil. But here, he could no longer stand. His body betrayed him. His strength was gone. And yet, the figure did not move to finish him. There was no cruelty in the blow, only purpose. This was not punishment. It was transformation. Because sometimes God must break something in you before he can bless you. Jacob didn't know it yet, but this wound would become a defining mark, a turning point. He would never walk the same again. The limp would follow him every step for the rest of his life. But it would not be a mark of shame. It would be a sacred scar, the sign that he had met God in the dark and survived. And more than survived, he had been changed. Isn't that how it often is? We pray for peace, for healing, for joy. And instead, we find ourselves wrestling through sleepless nights, through seasons of confusion, through battles we never asked for. And sometimes, just when we think we've endured enough, we feel it. The breaking point. The moment when something inside us gives way. The relationship ends. The job falls through. The illness comes. The silence stretches too long. And it feels like we've lost. It feels like God has touched us in the most painful place. And maybe he has, but not to destroy us, to name us. Because when God breaks something in you, it's not out of cruelty, it's out of intimacy. He breaks the things that keep you from him, the pride, the fear, the need to prove, the illusion that you're in control. He wounds what is false in order to reveal what is eternal. And in that wound, we find the truth. Jacob lay in the dust, panting, broken, weak. The struggle should have been over, but still, he would not let go. His grip tightened, not in strength but in desperation. This was not the grasp of a man trying to win anymore. This was the grasp of someone who finally understood what he needed most. The blessing. Not the kind you steal. Not the kind you manipulate from an old, blind father. Not the kind that comes with possessions, or position, or power. But the blessing of being known. The blessing of being renamed. The blessing that only God can give. After you've been broken, after you've been emptied, after your hip is dislocated and your pride is left in the dirt. Jacob, in that moment, stopped fighting to get something and started clinging to someone. And maybe that's when everything truly changed. Because when the blessing finally comes, it doesn't come to the strong. It doesn't come to the perfect or the proud. It comes to those who've wrestled through the night and held on, even when the pain was unbearable. It comes to the ones who dare to say, through tears and trembling, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." There was no more hiding now, no more pretending. Jacob was exposed, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And God had met him there, not in triumph, but in weakness. And it was in that weakness that grace found him. Jacob's voice trembled, not from fear now, but from something deeper. Exhaustion, or desperation. His hands clung to the figure in the dim light of dawn, fingers digging into flesh that felt real, and yet, somehow not of this world. His entire body ached, his hip burned with searing pain, every movement sending fire through his side. He could no longer wrestle, he could no longer stand, but still, he refused to release his grip. "I will not let you go," he whispered, "unless you bless me." They were not words of demand, not anymore. They were a cry from the very depths of his soul, from a place that had spent decades reaching, grasping, deceiving, pretending. Jacob had wanted many things in his life. He had wanted success. He had wanted recognition. He had wanted safety. But now, at the end of himself, with the night nearly over and his strength completely spent, Jacob realized what he had needed all along was something only God could give. A true blessing, not a stolen one, not a temporary one, but a blessing that reached down past the layers of identity he had built and touched the center of who he truly was. "I will not let you go." It wasn't the statement of a man trying to win a battle anymore. It was the plea of someone who finally understood that the real victory was not in overpowering God, but in holding on to him, even in weakness, especially in weakness. Jacob's life had been one long pursuit. Every relationship, every decision, every twist of fate had brought him to this exact moment, a bruised and limping man refusing to let go of the divine. He had nothing left to offer, no leverage, no strategy, no strength, just his wounded self, clinging tightly to the only one who could give him what he truly longed for. A new identity, a new beginning. Because Jacob wasn't just asking for favor. He wasn't just begging for protection from his brother Esau, who waited on the other side of the river. He was asking for something even more daring, to be changed, to be seen, to be named by God himself. That kind of request requires more courage than any fight. The figure looked at him, still silent, still calm, and asked the question that would shatter everything Jacob had built around his identity. "What is your name?" It seems like a simple question. But for Jacob, it carried the weight of everything he had been and everything he had tried to hide. Years before, when he had stood before his blind father Isaac, the question had been the same. "Who are you, my son?" And Jacob had lied. "I am Esau," he had said, wearing his brother's clothes, covering himself in goat skins, pretending to be someone else. That lie had followed him every step of his life. It had fed his fear. It had driven him into exile. It had haunted every interaction. Because deep down, Jacob had believed that he was only worthy of blessing if he was someone else. But now, in this sacred moment, broken and undone, he had no mask left to wear. There was no deception left to cling to. So when the figure asked, "What is your name?" Jacob told the truth. "Jacob," he said, "not a hero's name, not a proud declaration, just the name of a man who had lived in the shadows of others, who had tricked and run and grasped and feared, a name that meant heel grabber, supplanter, the one who always had to pull others down to lift himself up." That confession, that truth, was the doorway to everything. Because it is only when we dare to admit who we really are that we become ready to be transformed. The figure looked at him and did not scold him, did not rebuke him. Instead, he gave him a new name. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob," he said, "but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and with man, and have prevailed." Israel, not because he had overpowered God, but because he had clung to him. He had stayed in the fight. He had faced the truth of himself and refused to run away. That was the victory. Not in the winning, but in the enduring. This was the blessing Jacob had been chasing his whole life. The blessing of being named by God, of being known fully and truly, and still loved, still chosen, still given a future. And the limp, that would never leave him. It was part of the blessing now, because some blessings don't come through strength. They come through surrender. Jacob had started the night alone, afraid and in control. He would end it broken, blessed, and forever changed. The sun began to rise over the river's edge, casting golden light across the earth, as if heaven itself were opening a new page. The long, silent struggle was over, and though his body was weaker than it had ever been, Jacob's soul was finally strong. He had held on. He had not let go. And in doing so, he had found the very thing he had been running toward all along. The blessing had been spoken. The name had been changed. And now Jacob, or rather Israel, began to understand what had really taken place in the darkness. He was still on the ground, his breath ragged, his body trembling, dust clinging to his skin and blood drying on the scrape along his elbow. The pain in his hip throbbed with every pulse of his heart. He could no longer stand straight. When he rose, he would do so with a limp, not just for a day or a week, but for the rest of his life. It was a strange kind of victory, one that left him wounded, broken, humbled, but also one that left him marked by God. The sun had begun to crest over the horizon now. It spilled golden light across the desert floor, reaching long shadows behind the rocks and bushes, revealing what the night had hidden. Birds began to stir in the trees. The wind shifted, brushing against Jacob's face like the breath of a new beginning. And yet, he did not move quickly. He sat there for a while longer in silence, letting it all sink in. He remembered the moment of the touch, that simple, devastating gesture that dislocated his hip. It had come not as an act of violence, but of divine intimacy. As if God himself had said, "Let me mark you, not with words, but with the kind of wound that reminds you who you really are." It would have been easier, perhaps, to receive a crown or a robe. Something regal, something visible and glorious. But that's not how God works with those he loves most deeply. He does not decorate the surface, he transforms the soul. And soul change always comes with pain. This wound was not a punishment. It was a sacred gift, the kind of gift that forces you to slow down, to walk differently, to see the world from a lower place, to depend not on speed or strategy or strength, but on grace, real grace. Jacob had spent his whole life standing tall on shaky legs, pretending to be stronger than he was. Now he would move forward forever limping, but it would be a holy limp, one that declared to the world, I have wrestled with God, and I survived. And not just survived, he had been transformed. He had been Jacob, the deceiver. Now he was Israel, the one who contends with God and lives. That name would echo through generations. It would become the name of a people, a nation, a legacy of divine struggle and faithfulness. But in this moment, that name was still tender. It was a whisper between him and God, a secret spoken in the dark. And the wound in his hip was the seal of it, proof that the encounter had been real. Jacob thought back on all the years that had led him here. The heel grabbing at birth, the stew that bought the birthright, the disguise he wore before his blind father, the flight from Esau, the years under Laban, tricking and being tricked, the wealth he had gathered, the family he had built, the slow, unshakable awareness that for all he had gained, something had always been missing. Now he knew what it was. It wasn't just a blessing, it was this, an encounter with God that left no part of him untouched, the kind that doesn't just change your path, it changes your posture. It humbles you, it marks you, it gives you a story that no one else can tell, but you. This was the moment Jacob had always needed, not the moment of pretending, but of becoming. He stood now, slowly, carefully. The pain in his side screamed with every shift of weight. He leaned heavily to one side. The leg would never be the same, but as he took his first step, he realized something astonishing. He was walking with more confidence than ever before. Not because of pride, not because of achievement, but because now, for the first time, he wasn't walking in his own name. He wasn't walking in the shadow of deception. He was walking in the name God had given him. And that made all the difference. His limp was not a weakness, it was a testimony that God does not abandon us when we struggle, that he is not afraid of our questions, our fears, our fights, that he comes close enough to touch and sometimes close enough to wound. Because in the wounding, we are reborn. Jacob limped toward the rising sun, toward his future, toward his brother Esau, no longer the man he had been, no longer the trickster or the runaway. Now, he was the man who had wrestled with God and lived, the man who had held on in the night and would never walk the same again. And that limp, that sacred limp, would remind him every day that the blessing had come, and it had come through the wound. The sky was no longer black. A soft golden light now stretched across the edge of the earth, slowly erasing the shadows that had hidden Jacob's struggle. The stars, once sharp and cold in the desert sky, began to fade, retreating as the sun climbed over the horizon. The world was waking, and Jacob was limping. He stood on trembling legs, every movement igniting pain through his side, pain that radiated from the hip that had been touched, or perhaps healed, by a mysterious divine hand. With each step, the wound reminded him of the night he had just endured. But he did not resent it. He did not curse it. That wound had become sacred. It was no longer just a mark of weakness. It was a sign that he had met God, face to face, and lived. He looked across the river. The water sparkled in the morning light, as if nothing unusual had happened during the long, dark night. The current moved steadily, indifferently, but on the far side of the river was the one thing Jacob had feared more than anything: Esau, his brother, his past. It was strange how little he feared him now. The fear had melted somewhere in the struggle, dissolved in the long hours of wrestling and pain and surrender. Before the night, Jacob had been filled with dread. He had sent gifts ahead of him, flocks, herds, messengers, all to soften the heart of the brother he had wronged so long ago. He had prayed anxiously, dividing his family in case disaster struck. His mind had been racing with plans, calculations, ways to minimize loss. But now there was only stillness, not because the threat was gone. He didn't know if Esau would welcome him or kill him, but because something within Jacob had changed. The struggle had prepared him. This was no longer about manipulating the outcome. It was about facing whatever came next, with open hands. He didn't need to control Esau's heart. He didn't need to orchestrate every moment. He had seen the face of God in the night, and once you've faced God, what man can truly frighten you? So he began to walk. Each step was deliberate, unsteady, and slow. His limp was pronounced now, obvious. It would be visible to anyone who saw him. There was no hiding the change. But Jacob didn't try to cover it up. He embraced it. He wore his weakness like a crown, not because it made him proud, but because it reminded him of who he really was and who he now was becoming. It was strange to realize that morning had finally come. The night had felt eternal. When he had first sent his family ahead and stayed alone on the riverbank, he hadn't expected anything like this. Maybe he thought he would pray, maybe reflect, maybe worry. But instead, he had encountered something far beyond his understanding, a holy confrontation that had left him breathless and wounded, and somehow healed. He knew now what the night had really been about. It wasn't about Esau, not really. It was about Jacob, about the man he had been, the lies he had told, the masks he had worn, the fears he had fed, the name he had clung to, the name that meant trickster, deceiver, striver. All of that had been stripped away, and now he had a new name, Israel. He didn't yet know what that name would mean for the generations to come, that it would become the name of a nation, a people, a promise. But in that quiet morning light, he knew what it meant for him. It meant he no longer had to run. He had wrestled, he had held on, and God had seen him. He had been known, not for the role he played or the lies he told, but for the person he truly was beneath all of it. And still, he had been blessed. That truth sank into him with every step. The sun rose higher. The air warmed. He could see the shapes of his family camp in the distance now, faint but steady. Children, wives, servants, people waiting, watching. People who would ask questions when they saw him limping. People who might not understand what had happened. But Jacob didn't worry about that. Some encounters are too sacred to explain. Some transformations are meant to be lived, not spoken. He would live his new name. He would live his limp. He would face his brother not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become and was still becoming. Because the truth is, when morning finally comes after a long night with God, you don't go back to who you were. You go forward, limping toward your future, with a name only God could give, with a wound only God could allow, and with a heart that finally understands. Blessing doesn't come from winning. It comes from holding on in the dark, from staying when you want to run, from daring to believe that even in your weakness, you are not forgotten. Morning had come, and Jacob, Israel, walked into it with pain in his side and peace in his soul. There is a kind of night we all know, the night that doesn't depend on the sun setting or the moon rising. It's the night of the soul, the kind that descends not around us, but within us. A darkness that fills the spaces of the heart where light once lived. And it comes, often without warning, just like it did for Jacob. But this night isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's an invitation, because sooner or later we all wrestle. Not always with angels, not always with visions, but with ourselves, with guilt that won't let go, with wounds that never quite heal, with memories that replay at the worst moments, with the creeping sense that we're not enough, or that we've become someone we never meant to be. We wrestle with fear, with questions we're afraid to ask out loud, with the silence of God that sometimes stretches too long for comfort. And in that darkness, it's tempting to run. We fill our days with noise, with work, with distraction, with busyness. Anything to keep from sitting still too long. Anything to avoid the silence that might reveal what we've buried inside. We scroll, we plan, we talk, we perform, we pretend. Because what waits in the silence can be terrifying. The truth of who we are, the ache of what we've lost, the haunting echo of our own need. But eventually, the night finds us, and we have to choose. Will we run again, or will we stay and wrestle? Jacob chose to stay. He didn't know what would come. He didn't plan to wrestle God. But when the moment came, he held on. And maybe that's the greatest act of faith we can offer. Not perfect words, not flawless theology, but the decision to stay in the struggle when everything in us wants to flee. We don't talk much about this kind of faith. We prefer the mountaintop stories, the miracles, the breakthroughs, but the kind of faith that changes you, that roots itself in your soul, is the kind that grows in the dark. It's the faith that shows up at 2 a.m. when anxiety floods your chest. The faith that whispers, God is still here, when your prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling. The faith that chooses to keep holding on, even when your hip is out of socket and you don't know what sunrise will bring. Jacob's story is not just about one man's transformation, it's about all of us. Because in one way or another, we all have a river we must cross, a fear we must face, a version of ourselves we must leave behind. There comes a moment when God doesn't just comfort us or speak softly, but wrestles us into the truth, into surrender, into blessing. And that night, for Jacob, was that moment. But he is not alone. Moses wrestled with the call to lead, stammering and afraid. David wrestled with guilt after his failure and sin. Job wrestled with suffering that made no sense. Jesus himself wrestled in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood, crying out, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Wrestling is not weakness. It is holy ground, because in the struggle, something happens that cannot happen any other way. The masks fall off, the false self is exposed, and God meets you there, not to shame you, not to destroy you, but to invite you into something deeper than comfort, transformation. Sometimes we think the goal of life is to avoid the struggle, but perhaps the greater calling is to enter it with honesty, with humility, with courage, and to wrestle for the blessing that waits on the other side. Not a blessing of riches or ease, but the blessing of being known, the blessing of walking away with a limp and a new name, the blessing of a soul that has seen the face of God and survived. There will be nights when you feel lost, when God seems distant, when nothing makes sense and everything hurts. In those moments, remember Jacob. Remember the man who didn't let go. Remember the God who didn't walk away. Remember that the struggle is the sacred space, the soil where the old self dies and the true self is born. So when your night comes, don't panic, don't run. Lean into the silence, lean into the pain, hold on. Not because you're strong, but because you believe there's a blessing hidden in the battle. And when the sun finally rises, you'll still be standing, maybe limping, maybe trembling, but changed forever. Jacob had wrestled in the dark and dawn had come. He had clung to God through the night and had been blessed, wounded, renamed. And now, as he limped forward into the day, one truth pulsed gently yet unshakably in his soul. The God he had wrestled was not distant, not indifferent, not cruel. He was a God who enters the struggle, not above it, not beside it, in it. That was the mystery Jacob could never have imagined before that night. That the Almighty, the creator of stars and seas, the one who had spoken to his grandfather Abraham in visions and called his father Isaac by name, would choose to wrestle with him, not speak from a cloud, not send an angel with a message, but come in person, silent, unnamed, and fight him, not to destroy him, but to meet him exactly where he was, on the edge of fear, on the edge of guilt, on the edge of a life he didn't know how to live anymore. And God didn't fight with lightning bolts or booming commands. He came like a man, flesh pressed to flesh, a grip that held firm, a body that struggled in the dust. The all-powerful one, reduced to arms and sweat and silence. Why? Because Jacob didn't need a lesson. He needed an encounter. And so do we. We don't always need answers. We don't need a perfectly timed miracle or a sign in the sky. What we need, more than anything, is the God who is not afraid of our mess. The God who comes into the middle of the fight, not to lecture us, but to hold us there. To meet us in the most human way possible, through struggle, through touch, through silence, through presence. This is not the God of easy fixes or shallow comfort. This is the God who shows up at midnight, when your plans have failed, when your past has caught up, when the river ahead is wide and you don't know if you'll survive the crossing. This is the God who steps into your fear and says nothing at all, just wrestles you into surrender. This is the God who will not let you fake your way through the night, who won't let you escape through another excuse or performance. This is the God who waits until you're alone, no more distractions, no more crowds, no more running, and meets you in the dust of your own undoing. And he lets you fight. He doesn't overpower you. He lets you push. He lets you question. He lets you strain and struggle and resist. Because he knows that something sacred happens when you stop pretending to be strong and finally admit how desperate you are for him. And when you are at your weakest, when your hip gives way and your hands shake and all you can do is cling, that's when he blesses you. Not with more comfort, but with more truth. Not with quick fixes, but with lasting transformation. He doesn't always heal the limp, but he gives you a name that reflects who you are becoming, not who you have been. A name not defined by your failures or your fears, but by the encounter you dared to have in the night. That is the God who enters the struggle, not the one who waits for you to be perfect, not the one who demands you clean yourself up first, but the one who comes in the form of mystery and pain and grace and refuses to let you go until you've truly seen him. And maybe that's the most beautiful part. He didn't just allow Jacob to hold on. He held on too. He stayed. All night, all the way through the fight, through Jacob's resistance, through the anger and fear and questions. He stayed. He didn't leave when it got messy. He didn't vanish when Jacob clung to him. He didn't say, "That's enough." He said, "Now, I will bless you." Because God is not afraid of the dark. He is not afraid of your pain, not afraid of your doubts, not afraid of your sin, your struggle, your story. He is the God who meets us in the middle of it all and wrestles us not into defeat, but into identity, into purpose, into blessing. So if you find yourself in the dark, afraid, alone, uncertain, remember Jacob. Remember the long night. Remember the grip that did not let go. Remember the limp and the name and the mourning. And most of all, remember this. The God of Jacob is still the God who enters the struggle, and he is still willing to wrestle with you, to stay with you, to bless you, not after you've won, but because you didn't let go.